Shadow Catcher is a special kind of shader. It's applied to a texture, but it's not for regular rendering. It's not like a metal or a cloth or a plastic. Shadow Catcher is for one purpose, and that's for compositing images. So here, say I have either a photo of a real image or in this case, just a simple render that's already done. I don't want to edit this, or maybe I don't have access to it. This one happens to be a bitmap. Maybe I have a bitmap and I don't have this scene available, so I can't re-render it with more objects in it. But I want to place a chair here, and I want the shadow to match the other shadow directions. I want it to go that way. All I need to do that is build the actual object, have a light that aims the shadow the way I want. So in this particular example, we can tilt it around, aim the shadow the way I want, and then what we apply the shadow catcher texture to is not this object, the actual chair. We apply it to the room that we're putting it in. And I've put this grid here just to demonstrate a point about casting shadows. The only thing you really need is the floor if you're only going to be casting a shadow on the floor, which is the case here. We're only going to be casting a shadow down here on the floor. If we needed it to cast against the floor and then up the wall, we would have to model that geometry here. I would need a wall for the shadow to fall on. But now that we've attached the shadow catcher texture to these two objects, we get this result. First, we'll have our source object, which is this just an example sphere here. And then we have the shadows. But I got too many shadows. I got my source object here. I got my source object and its shadows. But I also got these extra options here. I also got these extra shadows from the shadow catcher texture adding that. So what I want to do is edit the shadow catcher. And this is a special shadow catcher texture. So the only thing that's on is shadow catcher. I can't change these other options because shadow catcher is all that this texture is doing. You can't make it a color and a shadow catcher. But it does have a number of parameters. Here it's going to catch shadows, and the color of that shadow is going to be dark black. The shadow strength, this is a little more difficult. You're going to need to tune this as you render. So once you go ahead and update it, this one we've done a little darker. And then this shadow, we've gradually brightened it. I believe this one's about 10%. But what we've done here, the difference between these two is I've edited the shadow catcher. And in the settings, I have it catching all the shadows, but I also have it not casting shadows. You would want it to cast shadows if you need shadows on top of your geometry. You'd have to build an object that had shadows on top of it. So if you had a gridded window and you wanted a gridded shadow, you would leave this on. But I want it to not cast shadows. It just receives them, so I have it turned off. Next. So now we only have the shadows casting from the objects that we textured and that we care about. We only have that shadow. And we can even do this. We can also add some reflection. So in this scene, the floor is a little reflective. So we've added reflection to that, and that's very simply done in the shadow catcher texture. Under Edit, we actually have reflection strength. This version doesn't have it, but my shadowless shadow catcher with reflection has that turned on. So in here I have a reflection strength of about 5. Generally for wood flooring and things that are a little bit glossy, a very low value is what you'll want. Anything higher and it'll make it look as if the floor is polished or waxed. That's when you would turn that up, but otherwise you wouldn't. This controls how faded the actual shadow is. So this value goes down, the shadows become smoother and less pronounced. If you turned it all the way up to 100%, it would be a solid black shadow, which just depends on your scene. And now the point of this is that we can do multiple iterations. So I've rendered out a few different options here at various angles. So now we can grab these, and this viewport now will have no fill to it. So we can apply it directly into our scene and check and see if the shadows go the correct direction. I don't like the way that one turned out. Pull this one in. A little bit of an angle. I don't like that one. We can grab this one, pull it in, and that one seems to go the angle, not only the angle I want, but it has a little bit of the reflectivity that I like here. That got me my shadows and a little bit of reflection. And for the viewport, we simply turn off the crop, and it lets you do some basic compositing just directly in Vectorworks. I didn't have to pull this out or export it in order to get that overlay. However, if you have Photoshop or you have GIMP or you have another application you want to export to, you can export this with the empty area here as an alpha transparency, but there's one thing you need to take into consideration. Go to File, and then Export. And when you go to Export Image, you can use any of the options. We'll just use Marquee here. And we're going to export this whole thing. We need to make sure that we pick a file type that supports an alpha channel. I generally go with PNG, and we need to save that alpha channel. And if we see this now, this will be completely transparent. I believe if I uncheck this and render it, this would render solid. So if I don't have this checked, this will render either a solid white or it'll show my crop border. Saving the alpha channel will make sure that this is a transparent image. And then that would export just fine, and I could composite it outside without having to do that green screening trick to get shadows or to get reflections that some people have been doing. This just saves you a number of steps. So again, the shadow catcher is a nifty feature added in 2018, primarily designed for when you're compositing images or if you don't want to re-render the entire scene. Again, you just want to add an object to it.